YouTube. Okay, so in this workshop, we're going to be talking about common myths about teaching and learning. And before we do anything else, we're going to do a screen share. You may be watching this over YouTube or from Google+, or maybe you're watching a recording. But if you're watching it live, you'll be able to participate in the polling. In the announcement, there was information on connecting to Socrative so that you can participate in the polling. And the room number for that is 136745, and you might be able to see that at the top of this screen. Up in the, it's not showing very well. But again, the room number is 136745 if you'd like to participate in the polling. So now let's do a screen share, and we'll be starting in just a second. We run into some technical problems here, or I ran into some technical problems. And now you should be able to see the screen, and you should very shortly see a presentation pop up. Very, very slowly. Okay. So again, we're going to be talking about some common myths in teaching and learning. And the first thing we're going to do is a little bit of a poll. And the poll, if you have Socrative active, the student version of it, you can vote on one of the outcomes here. And we'll start a quick question here. We'll see how many people are able to see this. And this is just a true-false response. So that will be starting in just a second. You'll be able to see the results on the screen here as people voted. So far we have one vote for false. And the question again is, students learn more when the instructional format matches the student's learning style. And I know there's 4 people at least who are trying to connect from outside, but there seem to be some technical problems. Okay, well, I hate to close the polling with just one vote. This would like to get one more vote from here. Okay, we have 3 votes now, and so far everyone is voting for false. Okay, so there should have been 1 vote for true and 2 votes. Okay. Oh, submit answer. There we go. Okay, so now we've got a vote of 2 to 3. Okay. So I was hoping we could get more people in on the chat, but we'll work on that for the next time. I'll learn more and be better prepared next time. So let's move on and see what the answer is. And the answer is pretty much false. This is one of those things that pretty much everyone believes, especially students, because they've grown up being told that they are visual learners or auditory learners or something similar. And the only problem is there's virtually no research that actually supports that. The most common way in which people have tested this is they've done tests of learning styles, and there's over 70 different learning style categorizations or inventories are out there. But with any of the major ones, they've classified students according to their learning styles. They've given them controlled experiments where they gave them instruction consistent with the learning style. And then what they found is that students who are auditory learners did not learn more from auditory instructions than other students, that there was no statistically significant differences in the amount that they learned based on their alleged learning style. So basically, learning styles seem to be entirely uncorrelated with how people learn in pretty much every study that's ever been done. There are some exceptions, that people who are deaf don't do very well with auditory learning. Blind students don't do very well with visual learning. But pretty much, except for those extremes, it doesn't really matter.
I wasn't sure about that. So how do you define learning style if it has nothing to do with how someone learns best?
People have written lots of papers on it. They've sold lots of instruments, and they make a lot of money by convincing people that they should administer these instruments and test people to measure their learning styles. And then they classify learning styles, and they give workshops to teachers on how to teach according to the learning styles. But other than that, there really isn't much. That basically, there seems to be everyone learns, and what the research seems to show is that we all learn in pretty much the same ways. That, we take in information through a senses, we process it in fairly similar ways, and then we integrate that into what we already know. But auditory learners don't do better with don't gain more from auditory instruction than does anybody else. And similarly, others don't do any less well than auditory learners when they hear things. So basically, the evidence is pretty overwhelming that it just doesn't matter. Now, this is one of those things that some advocates of learning style, or those who basically still talk about learning styles, suggest may not be all that bad, because it encourages instructors to use a diverse mix of teaching styles. It's consistent with universal design approaches, where you devise things that work with a wide range of students, including students with various disabilities. But to that extent, it's not a bad thing, because by varying activities, you do end up improving learning. That if you don't just keep boring students with one method of introducing things, if you don't just lecture at them continuously and they get to interact in other ways with the material, switching the activities by itself is a good thing. So to the extent to which people believe in it, it may not be a bad thing, except when students are convinced that they can only learn things one way. When students are told that they're a tactile learner, that they can only learn things from hand-on, or a psychomotor learner, or whatever. There's many different classifications. But if students are convinced that learning styles are real and they can't learn in some ways, then that sort of priming can do some real harm to students. So, basically, if people believe in learning styles, or students believe in learning styles and take it too seriously, it can do a lot of damage. And there's a study listed on the screen, one of the more famous ones, but there have been dozens of studies out there. This is just one that was very comprehensive, and pretty much. So now let's try another question. And so we're going to go to another true/false question, and that states that students retain. Sorry, there we go. Okay. So we should have another one. Let's try that again. It's a little slow starting here. So now the question is, do students retain knowledge better when faculty have a more organized lecture where everything flows seamlessly and logically from one point to another, as opposed to one with small logical gaps? So far we have 0 votes, 1 vote for false. Normally, if I was giving this in a presentation, we wouldn't be popping up the results until it comes in, but given the limitations of Google Hangouts, we can't, it's hard to hide it without shutting down that screen and loading back up again. So there may be some priming here where the first mover may influence the other people voting on answers. But again, we only have 1 vote so far. Well, okay, we'll go with this. And it turns out that, in fact, that 1 vote is correct. It is false. And there have been a number of studies of this. The most common way of studying this is where they have a script that an actor or a teacher will read in presenting some materials, where everything's organized, typically a PowerPoint presentation, and then students are tested. In one case, the material is put together in a very logical way. In the other case, the slides are jumbled a little bit and moved out of order, or a slide or 2 is removed. And then what happens is, when students are tested immediately after, the ones who had the cleaner presentation do a little bit better immediately. But if they're tested an hour or two later, or a day or a week later, the performance is much higher for those who had a less clear presentation. The argument for that is that if students are given some gaps, it creates, as Bjork and Bjork define it, desirable difficulties. That it's the act of wrestling with the information, trying to make sense of it, that forces them to learn it a bit more deeply. That if you sit there and everything sounds really logical, it makes a lot of sense, it's very easy for people to sit there more passively and not as actively work with the material and try to apply it in some way. So basically, there's a limit to this. You don't want it so disorganized that students are going to be confused, but you do perhaps want it. You want to, in general, you want to teach at a level where students have to think about the material have to process it as they receive it. So you don't want things to be so transparent that they don't have to think about it. They'll just sit there and nod and smile and so forth. In general, it's very helpful to challenge students, to push them a little bit beyond where they are. Another term for that is the zone of proximal development, that instructional designers often use. That if material is too easy or too simple or straightforward, students don't have to think about it a lot. If it's very difficult, they can get discouraged. But you want to find that line where students are forced to process things a bit. There's many ways of doing it. It could be through problems, it could be in presentation, it could be from group work. But in general, making them think and try to fill in some of the gaps themselves is pretty helpful. Okay, now here's another question. Do students learn concepts more quickly when they're blocked together and then forget them more quickly, or if they engage in interleaved practice, they have better long-term knowledge retention and transfer? What this is basically addressing is the question of whether it makes more sense to present material to students and then test them on it in a small, narrow topic, or whether it makes sense to have them work with a number of different things and then test them on a group of topics at once, basically. One example of this was a group of students. This is probably the best known example of this. A group of students were shown videos on determining the volume of 4 different shaped objects. One was the volume of a sphere, one was a cylinder, one was a prism, and one was a cube, I believe, or maybe I forgot what, or cone. And then in one case, they were shown the short videos and worked on problems immediately after that were related only to that one object shape. And then in the other time, they saw all 4 videos and they had to work on problems with it. So the question here is, do students do better if they're blocked together, so you have very well-defined presentation on something followed by some problems, or if you present many different things and then you have them answer multiple ones? So we have 1 vote for true. Any other votes coming in? We've got 2 votes for true. We still have 1 other person connected to the poll, but okay, well, it turns out that this is in fact true. Okay, and what happens is that in the short term, when they're shown the shapes of the objects and so forth, and they're tested on immediately, they can very easily apply the formulas for the area of spheres, cubes, and so forth. And so they do better with the block practice. But then if they're tested 1 week later with the exact same types of problems, the students who had the interleaved practice do significantly better. In fact, they did a little bit better a week later than they did when they were first exposed to the material. And again, it's probably the same type of thing that was going on with the earlier discussion, that when students have to wrestle with the material a little bit, in this case, when they have to determine not just which numbers to plug into the formula, that plug-in chug type thing, but they have to figure out which formula applies to the object they're working with, it forces them to process things a little bit more extensively, to make more connections, so that they're more likely to remember it in the long term. one theme of a lot of the research is the more that students have to struggle with the material, the more they're going to remember it in the long term. You know, when students were presented things logically as a group, they worked with some problems on it, they got about 90% of them correct, compared to the other group who had to discriminate and decide which formula applied in which case and had to remember all those formulas at once. But a week later, they did even better than the ones who had it all logically blocked. So again, having a little bit more difficulty early on can be helpful. And you know, many of us have, this is one thing that's forcing me to reevaluate how I teach my classes a little bit, because I had done this in my class. I had taken each week's topic and I had a very narrowly defined granular subtopics with repeated quizzing on it. The only thing I did that worked a little bit to compensate for this is I had a comprehensive quiz at the end of each week. But now I'm thinking it may be better to vary it up and not have topics as granular or as broken down, because just being able to work with one problem in isolation isn't really as helpful as being able to think about which concepts apply, or which models apply, or which equations apply in each case. Similarly, they did this in art history, where in one case they would study a particular school and with a group of artists in it, and they'd have students identify that. In the other case, they broke it up where there were multiple schools with different artists, and they found, again, in the short term, when they had quizzing immediately followed very, very narrowly defined schools like the Impressionists and so forth, the students did much better initially, but they didn't remember it as long. When they had a series of presentations and then they had to determine which school each artist and each piece of art fell in, they did much better in the long term, even though they had to struggle more in the short term.
I was wondering about that, if the subject matter would determine.
It's been done in a few different areas. I'm only familiar with, I think, I've only seen really 3 of those, but it seems to, if it works in both math and art, it's probably likely to happen in many other disciplines too. And this is a more recent study. Let me just reset this here. And the question is, do students retain more information if they take notes on a laptop or when they take handwritten notes? Okay, so do students retain more? Okay, the statement is students retain more information from presentation when they take notes on a laptop than when they record handwritten notes. We have 1 vote. And we lost one person in the poll. Well, it turns out that is in fact false. And so you are correct. Basically, what happens is that probably the best known study is this one. It just came out last spring, and what they found is that students who work on laptops tend to try to write down a whole lot more. That basically they're trying to take down verbatim notes, and as a result, they're spending all their time basically hearing words and typing them without processing them quite a bit. When students have to take notes with handwriting, they tend to be much more careful. They can't write as much. They can't write as quickly with their hands as they can type typically. And as a result, they're forced to think about what the most important concepts are. And again, that act of processing information, filtering it down to the most essential concepts, seem to be fairly important in terms of their ability to recall it. So when people were quizzed on the contents of a lecture presentation, right at the end of it, this was with randomized controlled experiments, those who worked with laptops wrote quite a bit more, but they didn't remember as much. Those who took handwritten notes on average wrote less, but they performed significantly better. Now, there may be ways around that if you could train students to be more efficient at taking notes with laptops, but in general, their fault is perhaps to do a bit less well. Okay, now this one's a little bit more complicated as a statement. It says that all that matters in terms of long-term knowledge retention and transfer is is the total time spent studying. It does not matter how that time is spaced. So the first option is true, only total study time matters. The second is false, holding study time constant. Longer blocks of study time right before an exam results in increased long-term knowledge retention and transfer. And the last option, C, is false, holding study time constant. Greater spacing of study time results in increased long-term knowledge retention and transfer. In other words, does it matter how people spread out their studying? If it doesn't matter, if all that matters is the total number of hours they spend studying, A would be the best answer. If mass study, where they spend a lot of time in large block studying, is more important, then B would be correct. C would be correct if it's more important to space out that study time. So far we have 1 vote for C. We have 2 votes for C. We have 3 votes for C. Okay, so in fact, C is correct. That spacing study time is incredibly important. And let's just look at some of the results here that show that. And well, one of the best studies of this perhaps was Dunlofsky, Rawson, Marsh, Nathan, and Willingham in 2013. But you can't all see this, but one of the things they did is they constructed a series of 6 practice sessions, 6 classes. I think they were an hour apiece. And in one case, they spread them out. They had them 6 days in a row. So students basically went to this class 6 consecutive days. In another case, they had 1 day between the sessions, so it was spread out over 12. Another, they did it over 6 months with 30 days between the sessions. And then they tested them 2 days, 3 days, 4, I'm sorry. And they tested them, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, 6 days, and then 30 days after the session. And what they found is that when students took the classes back to back in 6 days, they did the best immediately, okay, among all those groups. But it started to get narrower and narrower as you went out 6 days beyond that. But then if you go out to 30 days after the last session, the students who took the classes 30 days apart by far did the best. So what happens basically in terms of long-term, in the short-term mass study where you spend a lot of time cramming for something over a period of, say, 6 days and you're very immersed in it, does much better in terms of immediate recall. And even a few days later, it does better. But 30 days later, the students who had the classes 30 days apart ended up scoring at over a 90th percentile, while those who had them back-to-back were only about a 68th percentile on this particular test. So again, one of the arguments here and what the research seems to suggest is that you're most likely to remember things if you recall them with a bit more difficulty. That if you just talked about something a day before, there's not a lot of effort placed in recalling. But if you go back and you have to remember things from a month before, it's a lot harder. And the act of trying to retrieve information that's a little bit more distant reinforces it and creates links that makes it easier to retrieve in the future. And so in terms of long-term retention, spacing of study sessions is very important, which raises some important questions maybe about 3-week summer classes or winter session courses. That you can remember much more when you take the course over a longer period of time than a shorter periods of time. Okay, now the next question is low stakes for no. Most of you guys know this stuff. Sorry about that. These are supposed to be common myths. And when I've done this in a larger group, generally most people get the wrong answers. But okay, so this question is, low stakes or no stakes testing is more effective in encouraging long-term knowledge retention and transfer than rereading, highlighting, concept mapping, or any other technique generally practiced by students? Which is a very strong statement. Okay, we finally have some disagreement here. We got one for A and one for B. So there goes the priming. So let's see how it goes from here. Anyone else want to vote? Well, okay, we'll call it tied. And in fact, this is true. There have been a number of studies of this. Again, Donlowski, Rawson, Nathan, and Willingham is probably the best known one. But let's look at some of the tables from there. And what happens basically is they looked at the proportion. They gave students a number. They randomly divided students into several groups. In one case, they just studied the material once after it was presented. In another case, they repeated study, so they studied it in 2 separate sessions. In the third case, they used concept mapping, where students had to create concept maps. And then in the other case, they just gave them a short quiz on the material. And what they found was that with either verbatim questions, where they were just directly testing recall of information, students did by far the best with retrieval practice. And with inference questions, where they had to apply some knowledge transfer, where they had to take the concepts and apply them in other circumstances, they also did best with retrieval practice. Yet when students were asked what was most effective, they believed that study, or what students thought was most helpful, was repeated study. Study was second most. Concept mapping they rated third, and retrieval practice they rated lowest. So the metacognitive predictions of students in terms of what they thought were most important turned out to be exactly the opposite of the order in which they turned out to be important. So that basically the way students are told they should study and the way they've been taught to study pretty much from elementary schools up is to go back and study and restudy and so forth. And some of our faculty tell people to do that even now. Some people will encourage them to draw a concept map to help them see how the concepts are connected. But basically, they don't do as well as low stakes or no stakes testing. And just following that up a little bit further, one criticism of this was that the tests were, I think they were multiple choice questions, and the perception was, well, maybe it was because the questions involved multiple choice that concept mapping wouldn't have been as useful. So what they did then is, in one case, they use short answer questions in one group, and then they use concept maps for another type of test. And basically, just to summarize it fairly briefly, when students were tested with concept maps, where they had to draw concept maps showing relationships, they still did better if they had some prior low stakes tests, or if they had a prior test on the material. So even when they're being tested using concept maps, concept mapping didn't work as well in helping their ability to understand and recall the information as prior testing on it. But again, the metacognitive predictions here were exactly the opposite of the actual results. And we see that an awful lot. One other study that was done is they broke students up into 3 groups. In one case, they had them study, 4 sessions. Another case, they had study, and then test the material. Then the other, they had them study, test. And what they found is that when they were tested again, 5 minutes after they finished the sequence, the students who studied 4 times did the best. Those who were studied and tested did the next best, and those who studied and tested 3 times had the next highest score. But when they were tested just 1 week later, the students who were tested the most recalled the most. So that testing effect, which has been known for like nearly a century now in prior studies, is really important. That testing students on anything pretty much helps them recall it more than anything else that students tend to do. And again, though, when students were asked for their metacognitive predictions of what was most effective, they thought repeated study was more effective than being tested, partly because students don't enjoy being tested. They'd rather sit there and look through the material and try to make sense of it. But in a way, by being tested on it, they're forced to make sense of it in a way that perhaps they don't when they're just rereading the material. They get there's something called fluency bias, that where they read the same things over and over again, they get this perception that they're fluent in it and they understand it. But unless they actually apply the material, they don't understand it as well. So that repeated testing effect is really important. Now, one reason perhaps for the metacognitive bias where students perceive it the opposite of what actually happens in terms of long-term is that immediately they do a little bit better. So that if it's 5 minutes before an exam, repeated study and cramming is the most effective. But if they're going to try to understand it over a longer period of time, which is what we generally would hope that they would do, testing them repeatedly is much more effective.
Isn't it possible that this is caused by the fact that we're finding out how much they know by testing them, and we are giving them practice being tested? Maybe they're just getting better at being tested because they're being tested repeatedly. We can't actually go into their brains and see what their recall is, see what they actually understood.
Right, but this has been done in a variety of different formats, so with different materials, and even if even when the test involved concept maps, where they had to create concept maps in response to a prompt, they still did better when they had been tested. So the test was using concept maps basically to test them. So they weren't tested with the same type of instrument that they would use in the initial testing. They still did better with the previous testing. So it's possible. In some of the studies, that's a potential flaw. But the studies are so robust, you know. It's a good point, and it's always a possibility. Yeah, there's a lot of good studies here. Another is that students were given Swahili-English word pairs, so they didn't have a lot of familiarity with it in a controlled experiment. They either had practice testing or review, that when they were repeatedly tested on the word pairs, though, they performed at 80%. If they had restudied using the same amount of time, they only scored at 36%. And so, you know, the one theory basically is that the act of retrieving information helps you retrieve that information a little bit better. So that just repeatedly trying to store the information doesn't really help you retrieve it. It's the practice retrieving the information that's important, and being able to retrieve and apply the information later.
And were there situations where they were told they were being tested?
In each case, they were told they were going to be tested on the material. But in one case, they did it by repeated. The control group was basically studying it repeatedly, and in the other case, they were tested on it, but they knew they would be tested at the end on it. So they had the same incentive. I don't think they were paid. They might have been paid for participating, or more typically with most of these, they get extra credit in courses for the research, because most of this is done with academic research. Okay, here's another statement, which is that high-stake exams encourage students to study harder and results in improved long-term knowledge retention. This is kind of the heart of the European model, where you only have that final exam at the end. We've got one vote for false. Any others? Well, okay, it's kind of consistent with the low stakes testing one. So yes, it is in fact false. And basically the argument is, if there's high stakes exams, people tend to cram and you don't have as much distributed practice. They do better in the short term by cramming, by spending a large block of time right before exams, but they don't remember much of it later. That most of the material is forgotten very quickly. Now here's another one, and this perhaps may be a little more controversial. And that is that a higher level of subject matter expertise makes it easier to assist students in learning. We have one vote for false. Anyone else? Okay, in fact, the research generally finds this to be false, which is one of the reasons why peer work and peer instruction is so effective. Carl Wyman has a really nice article about it, which he calls the curse of knowledge, why our intuition about teaching often fails. He had another article where basically he suggested that his best lectures were probably his least effective lectures, because when he went out and he gave a beautiful talk that all fit together logically, students didn't have to wrestle with it, which is a concept we talked a little bit earlier. But basically, one of the things that's been done is, well, let me give you a couple of examples of this. One is, I think it was the University of Maryland in their introductory biology class. They had graduate students TAs, and then they decided to experiment with undergraduate TAs. They tested all the students, the grad students as well as the TAs as well as the students in the class at the beginning and the end. And what they found is that the sections of the class that worked with undergraduate TAs had larger gains in learning than the ones that were working with graduate student TAs. In general, the peer instruction work from Eric Mazur and others have also found it. One of the things Carl Wyman cites basically is a very simple way of illustrating this was an experiment by Elizabeth Newton. She'd give people a list of 20 or 40 popular songs, and then she'd ask each person to do two things. One is to tap out the rhythm of the song, and to then estimate what proportion of the other participants would be able to recognize the song. And one of the things she noted is that the tappers overestimated the probability that other people could recognize it by a factor of 20, when in fact, when people were given the rhythm pattern, they were not any more likely. It came out to be about random guessing. People could not recognize the song from that, but the people who could hear it in their head while they were tapping thought it would be obvious to everybody. And that's basically the problem, that when we're the experts in the field, we actually use different portions of our brain to process material. We see a problem, we immediately know what category it fits in, what type of problem it is. We know how to address it. We know the basic tools in our discipline to work with it. And it's very easy for us to work with it, and it doesn't require a lot of mental processing. Students find it much more difficult. They see something out there, and it may look vaguely familiar, it may have some sort of connection, but they're not able to differentiate which models apply in which case. But students with similar levels of knowledge acquisition basically find it much easier to see the problems that other students are having and explaining in terms that are appropriate to that level of development. So that, this is something that many of us have a great deal of trouble with, but letting students explain things to each other, even though they may make some mistakes, tend to result in much better learning than we try to assist students. We often get frustrated when we explain things to students and we think it made a lot of sense, but they're not seeing it because they're not working from the same base. They don't have the same base of knowledge and concept that we have, and it's hard to get back to that level at times. And the evidence on this is pretty overwhelming. Okay, the next thing. Most sensory input in the classroom is visual or auditory, and it states that it's difficult to process both visual and auditory signals simultaneously. We've probably seen a lot of examples of this here. I'm reading this all because some of the people in the room here can't see the material, so. Oh, that's a good point. There's some lag, yeah. Partly because we're on wireless here, and partly because it's just internet lag. We got one vote for false. Got 2 votes for false. And it looks like that's all we're getting. Okay. In fact, this is true. that it is difficult to process it. There's something called dual channel theory. And apparently I forgot to put in a link to that, but or it comes up here. But what happens basically is if there's a text paragraph, let's say, on the screen, and the instructor is reading it, you can read it faster yourself than when you hear it, and you get this sort of cognitive dissonance that there's different logical pathways to process auditory signals and visual signals, and we can process visual information much more rapidly than we can process auditory signals, and it creates a little bit of a conflict because you're reading at a different pace than you're hearing it, and when people do that, they don't understand it as well. That you're better off just having this is the next question, sorry, but you're better off basically either putting the text up and letting students read it, or stating it without putting the text on the screen. When they're faced with both, they don't pick up as much as if they just had the information one way or another. There have been a number of controlled experiments, and currently I got to put in a link to that. But here's a related question. I was working on that. I added that one this morning, and that's probably where I lost the other one. Presentations with more visual imagery and less text result in enhanced recall. So if there's a PowerPoint presentation or a Prezi or something else, if there's more imagery, more pictures, more video, or more objects in it, and fewer words, does that result in more or less recall? Basically is the question. So if more visual imagery is helpful, then the answer should be true. We've got 2 votes for true. And in fact, that's what the research is beginning to suggest. Probably one of the better studies, or one of the more recent studies, is by Josh Cuevas, brain-based learning, myth and reality, testing learning styles and dual coding. And he's done some experiments basically by varying the mix of imagery and text. And in general, students recall information much better when there's visual imagery. So, it could be graphs, it could be pictures. But if there's fewer words on the screen that they have to read, they remember it much more than the larger the proportion of images to text, the more likely it is that students will remember the material later. It's at least some preliminary results. So it may not work for all disciplines and so forth, but
It's not false.
oh, that should be true. Yeah, sorry. I did that right as I got back from lunch. Sorry about that. So the answer is true. Sorry about that. I'll have to fix that. Okay, now here's a case where there have been a few studies. One of them was very nicely done by Dan Ariely. That student work will be of higher quality if students can select their own deadlines. Let me describe the experiment that he did. He had 2 classes that covered the same material. In each class, students had to create 3 papers. In one, he assigned deadlines a third of the way through the semester for each paper. And in the other, he let students assign their deadlines in the first week of the class. In either case, they could, as long as they submitted on time, they got whatever the full credit was, but they were penalized by 1 percentage point for each day it was late. So it wasn't a very severe penalty. The rational thing to do, perhaps, or this is what many economists would argue, would be to set all the deadlines on the last day and still plan on your own to submit them at 1/3 of the way through, or whatever works best with your other workload. But where would you guess students would do better? So the statement is students' work will be of higher quality if students get to select their own deadlines. Oh, A is false and B is true, and I should have done it the opposite. Because, because when I put this together, it was done with clickers and it wasn't done with this. So what, I'm sorry. This was, I believe they were upper level. It was either economics or psychology. He had a dual appointment at in economics and psych at MIT at the time. I think it was an economics class. Well, we've got two for either for A and yeah, we got some cognitive dissonance. It's like that thing with the red, blue, green where their names don't match. It turns out that having students set their own deadlines did not really help because there were a number of ways in which it was measured. That when students had deadlines evenly spaced, they did significantly better, whether they self-assigned evenly spaced deadlines or whether the instructor did. And the way they measured that was they had a group of people evaluate the papers and assign grades according to a rubric. They also looked at the word counts, and they also ran it through grammar checkers to check the number of grammatical errors. And the papers that had evenly spaced deadlines, whether that was self-assigned by the students or by the instructor in the one class, ended up being longer, having fewer grammatical errors, and doing much better on the rubrics as evaluated by the blind reviewers. So deadlines help, and that's all I've got. And again, it didn't work quite as well with the Google Hangout. Normally, everyone would be in the room and discussing the things and so forth. So any questions or comments? I'm going to go back over to the Hangout and see if we can get out of the screen share. And we have 5 viewers online, so not everyone is, we're going to stop this. So we now have the option, if anyone's out there and they want to comment, if you're connected, it looks like only one person is in the live Hangout, but I'm calling up the question and answer app. So if anyone's out there would like to post anything, you could, if you're doing it through Google+, you can post a question or a comment here and we can talk about it. Meanwhile, what do you guys have to say?
I think, like you were saying earlier, that students have been told these myths over and over again, and they start to believe it. And what we're learning now, when is this information shared with students to really let them know that what they're thinking of learning and how best to learn is actually incorrect in many instances?
It's not, for the most part, because when you do surveys of teachers, almost all teachers believe deeply in learning styles. I've had
Students
and instructors and students in our school of ed learn about learning styles and teaching to that. And I've had a number of students working in CEL who, who talk about their learning style inventories they work with and so forth. And, it's difficult. And what makes it a little bit tougher too is if you try to incorporate this in your classes by doing repeated testing and so forth, students don't like it. Yes. They don't think it's very effective. It helps them learn most effectively, but they don't think it does. Mm-hmm. And it goes against the grain a little bit. And it's hard to break that. And it would be nice if this research would make it into the elementary and secondary schools a little bit more fully. To some extent, it does a little bit with the flipped classroom models, which actually started in high school, because with that, the focus is on working with students and application problems in class, which is where they need the most assistance.
The other thing I was thinking about is that finding that right mix of comfort for students and also forcing them to struggle with learning. And students don't like it. And when it comes to being getting the evaluation for your instructional session, you might see that coming up in the comments. And so it's a good thing to encourage them to struggle, but if they're not liking it, you will see it in your evaluation session.
And it really helps if you can prime them to let them know about the research, that you learn best by making mistakes and learning from those mistakes. But again, it's hard to convince students of that, especially if they've been taught otherwise from early ages. If you can demonstrate it, it can help. I usually start my class. I have them do about 100 graded, 98 graded assignments in my large principles class, and they don't really like that very much because they'd rather just have 3 or 4 quizzes, or exams. But I talk a little bit about the research and so on, and some of them really catch on to it and like it, and they can see that they're learning better, and they get to take tests over and over. Some of the tests, 15% of the grade, an infinite number of times. None of them have, because it take a long time to do that. But some of them will take quizzes 10 or 12 times until they do well at it. And they can see that by the time they get to other tests, you know, the less granular tests, that they're able to do much better, and they find it much easier. And then when they have in-class exams of the midterm and the final that are weighted much more heavily, they can see that they're doing much better than they would have expected, and they understand it much more deeply. But a lot of them just see it as a lot of extra work that they're being forced to do that they see many other peers don't have to do. And it is difficult. And, you know, for tenured faculty, it may not matter as much, you know, in terms of evaluation, but I know it certainly doesn't help my evaluations. Look on great professor to see that. But what you have to do is convince them, or try to at least convince them, that they benefit from it. And to the extent to which you can make the testing low stakes, you know, so that it doesn't hurt them if they do badly, and then you put, you know, you have other tests that count for more, you might be able to convince them. But it's certainly an issue.
This is interesting too, to think about being more transparent with students about your teaching style and why you teach the way you do.
I have, because when I first changed my course, I went from a course where first there were 4 exams, 3 regular exams and the final, to having weekly exams and 3 regular exams on the final, to having 5 or 6 quizzes each week, and then a comprehensive quiz each week, and then a midterm and a final. And each step of the way, when I first switched over with the massive thing, and I also added clicker questions every day, they saw it as being an unfair burden. And, you know, I've learned that it really helps to prime them a little bit, to explain why you're doing it, and that it really helps them learn. And I can show them statistics. I can show that when I used to teach it the other way, because we have a test in economics called the Test of Understanding College Economics. By the end of the term, a typical student was scoring at the 50th percentile compared to national norms, you know, which isn't bad, you know. And they start off about there. Actually, earlier they were doing a little bit less well, but we don't talk about that so much. But now a typical student is somewhere around the 75th percentile, and nearly, 85 to 90% of them are above the 50th percentile. And I'll tell them that, and, you know, it doesn't always get through to them because they're up late at night trying to get all these quizzes done every week by the deadline, especially if they have some tech problems, and it's frustrating, especially if they keep failing some of the quizzes over and over again. But it does help them. What's in their own self-interest is not always what they think is in their interest, and it would be nice if they could learn that early on. Other comments or thoughts? And if anyone's out there, we're down to 5 viewers remotely, but if you have any comments, you can, if you're connecting through Google Plus, there's a question and answer box. You can just type in that. We're down to 3 viewers. Okay, so I guess we're pretty much done. Well, thank you all for joining, and I'll stop the broadcast, and this will be on YouTube in about 2 minutes.